March 19, 1945. Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein sat in a shattered farmhouse outside Kaiserslautern, staring at a map he no longer trusted. His Panzer Lehr Division, once the finest armored formation in the Wehrmacht, built from the instructors of Germany's own tank schools, had been torn apart in less than 72 hours. Not by overwhelming numbers, not by superior machines, by speed. By a man Bayerlein had studied for 2 years, a man whose file he had annotated in red ink, a man whose reckless audacity Bayerlein had privately dismissed as theater. He had been wrong. The reports on the table described the impossible. General George S. Patton's Third Army had crossed the Moselle River, driven 90 miles in 3 days, and was now cutting behind German lines faster than reserve units could be repositioned to meet them. Bayerlein set down his pencil. He had spent the last 4 years fighting the British, the Americans, the Russians. He had faced Montgomery at El Alamein and Eisenhower's armies in Normandy. None of them had done this. The question burning in his mind was not how Patton had broken through. The question was something far more disturbing. Why couldn't the Wehrmacht stop a man who openly announced exactly what he was going to do? To understand what Bayerlein faced in the spring of 1945, you must understand what he believed about war. Bayerlein was a professional. He had served under Rommel in North Africa, had commanded Panzer Lehr at Normandy, had survived the catastrophe at the Falaise Pocket. He understood armored doctrine at a cellular level. German military culture prized methodical planning, command hierarchy, and the careful integration of combined arms. The Wehrmacht did not improvise. It calculated. When OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, first compiled a serious intelligence assessment of Patton in the summer of 1944, the file was both impressed and skeptical. G2 reports from Army Group B described him as aggressive to the point of recklessness. A commander who committed his flanks before his logistics were secure, who pressed forward when doctrine demanded consolidation. German staff officers read these assessments and saw vulnerability. Patton's very boldness looked, on paper, like his weakness. If you could lure him forward, stretch his supply lines, then strike the exposed flank, he would collapse. That was the theory. It was a perfectly reasonable theory, built on sound military principles dating back to Clausewitz. The problem was that it had never worked. Not once. Between August 1, 1944, when Patton's Third Army became operational in France, and February of 1945, German forces had attempted to exploit his exposed flanks on at least 7 documented occasions. Every attempt failed. Not because Patton didn't have exposed flanks. He always did. They failed because by the time the German counterattack formed, Patton's men were somewhere else entirely. The confrontation that Bayerlein and other Wehrmacht commanders faced had a name inside OKW by the winter of 1944. They called it the Patton problem. And it was not primarily a problem of firepower or manpower. Germany still fielded Tigers and Panthers. The 88mm gun still outranged any American weapon system on the battlefield. The Wehrmacht's tanks were, by virtually every technical measure, superior to the Sherman's Patton drove. A Panther could penetrate Sherman frontal armor at fucking 500 meters. A Sherman required a precise shot at under 600 meters to kill a Panther at all. The numbers favored Germany, but numbers were not the problem. The problem was tempo. Patton operated on a decision cycle that the Wehrmacht's command structure literally could not match. A German corps commander receiving an attack report needed to verify it through his division, submit a recommendation upward through Army headquarters, receive authorization from OKW or Hitler himself. A process that routinely consumed 12 to 18 hours, sometimes longer when Hitler personally intervened. Patton's corps commanders had pre-authorized exploitation orders. They did not ask, they moved. In November 1944, Wehrmacht intelligence officer Major Percy Ernst Schramm documented this frustration in his diary with unusual candor. He wrote that fighting Patton was like striking at water. Every germ counter move arrived precisely too late. The position that justified the German response no longer existed by the time the response was mounted. Schramm's assessment was passed to Army Group G headquarters. It was noted, and then, fatally, it was not acted upon, because the structural changes required to match Patton's tempo would have required dismantling the very command hierarchy that made the Wehrmacht function. The Germans knew what was killing them. They could not stop doing it. The direct confrontation, the moment Bayerlein's shattered conviction finally broke open, came in 3 phases across 4 days in March 1945, and to follow it, you must understand the geography of the Palatinate. The Saar-Palatinate triangle sat between the Rhine, the Moselle, and the Siegfried Line. OKW had assessed it as defensible. The terrain was difficult. The road network was limited. German planners believed that any American advance would be channeled, predictable, vulnerable. They positioned Army Group G's remaining strength accordingly. Patton looked at the same map and saw something entirely different. He saw not a fortress, but a trap for the Germans. On March 13, 1945, Patton submitted his operational plan to General Omar Bradley. He proposed a double envelopment of the entire German force in the Palatinate, driving 2 corps simultaneously in converging arcs while a third pinned the German front. Bradley was skeptical. The logistics were marginal. The timetable was aggressive to the point of fantasy. Patton told Bradley he would have the Rhine in 10 days. Bradley approved it. The German response was precisely what Patton had predicted. Army Group G commander, General Johannes Blaskowitz, recognized the threat on March 14th and immediately requested permission from OKW to withdraw his forces north of the Moselle to avoid encirclement. The request went up the chain. Hitler denied it. German forces were ordered to hold. This was the moment the trap closed. What followed was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was a pursuit. Major General Manton Eddy's 12th Corps drove southeast at an average of 30 miles per day, a rate of advance that Wehrmacht planners had categorized as operationally impossible for a force of that size and supply situation. Patton had solved the logistics problem not by fixing it, but by outrunning it. His forces moved so fast that German units designated to block their advance were still receiving their orders when American columns were already 20 miles past the designated blocking position. Bayerlein's Panzer Lehr, tasked with establishing a defensive line near Kaiserslautern, received its movement orders on March 17th. By the time the lead elements reached their assigned positions, the 12th Corps was already to their north and east. Bayerlein had been handed a defensive mission in a location that no longer existed as a coherent defensive sector. He had roughly 40 operational tanks, perhaps 3,000 infantrymen, and no air cover. The Luftwaffe had long since ceased to be a meaningful factor. He had also, by this point, a very clear understanding of what he was facing. What he was facing was not recklessness. He had made that mistake before. What Patton had done in the Palatinate was ruthlessly logical. Every decision was downstream of a single strategic insight. The Wehrmacht's command structure was its most dangerous vulnerability. It could not be fixed in the field. It could not be adapted under pressure. It could be exploited with absolute consistency. Patton did not attack the German army where it was strongest: its equipment, its training, its tactical professionalism. He attacked it where it was broken, and it was broken at the top. There is a documented exchange from a post-war interrogation that crystallizes this. Bayerlein, speaking to American intelligence officers in May 1945, was asked directly what he believed Patton's greatest advantage had been. He did not say firepower. He did not say numbers. He said, "He understood before any of us that the war had changed into something we were not built to fight. We were built for a war of calculation." He fought a war of velocity. The face-to-face confrontation arrived on the morning of March 20th, 1945, though it was not the kind of confrontation that appears in dramatized accounts. There were no words exchanged across a table. Bayerlein was not present. The confrontation was geometrical. 2 commanders' wills expressed in the positions of their forces. colliding in the village of Ludwigshafen. Bayerlein had consolidated his remaining strength: 31 tanks, 2 infantry regiments at roughly 40% strength, and a battery of 88mm guns, in a defensive arc north of Ludwigshafen. By every tactical calculus, it was a sound position. The 88s had clear fields of fire across the main approach routes. The infantry occupied hardened positions. A direct assault would be costly. Patton did not conduct a direct assault. Major General Walton Walker's U-20 Corps had been driving east in a parallel track, and on the morning of March 20th, its lead elements, Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, cut south on secondary roads that Bayerlein's intelligence had assessed as unsuitable for armored movement. They had been assessed incorrectly. At 0630 hours, 16 Sherman tanks and a battalion of armored infantry appeared on Bayerlein's unprotected left flank, moving at combat speed. The 88s were pointing the wrong direction. In the space of 40 minutes, the battle was functionally over. Bayerlein's left flank collapsed. The 2 infantry regiments, cut off from their withdrawal routes, either surrendered or dispersed into the countryside. Bayerlein himself escaped with a staff car and 11 survivors. Of the 31 tanks he had positioned, that morning 22 were captured or destroyed. 9 escaped by driving north at maximum speed and running directly into an American roadblock established by 12th Corps 6 hours earlier. Those 9 tanks surrendered without firing a shot. Across the Palatinate, the pattern was identical. Between March 13th and March 25th, 1945, Third Army took 68,000 German prisoners. The Wehrmacht lost the equivalent of 12 full divisions, not destroyed in pitched battle, but encircled, outpaced, and collapsed in on themselves. American casualties in the same period totaled 5,220, of whom 1,030 were killed. The kill ratio was not a function of better weapons. It was a function of a better decision cycle operating against a command structure too rigid to adapt. Bayerlein had challenged Patton the only way a professional soldier could, by positioning his best remaining force in favorable terrain, with sound tactics, and waiting. Patton's answer had been to make the position irrelevant before the battle began. This was the confrontation. One commander who asked where the enemy would attack. Another who asked where the enemy was not capable of moving fast enough to stop him. The second question had a better answer. The evidence that what happened in the Palatinate was not a fluke, not the product of desperate German weakness, but a systematic demonstration of a genuine operational principle. This evidence comes from 3 distinct sources, and each one tells the same story. First, the numbers. Third Army's operational statistics between August 1944 and May 1945 are extraordinary in their consistency. Across 9 months of continuous operations, Patton's forces advanced a total of 5,860 miles, the longest sustained advance of any army in the European theater. They liberated 81,522 square miles of territory. They inflicted 1.8 million casualties on Axis forces while sustaining 186,000 of their own. The ratio is not the product of firepower parity. German tanks were technically superior throughout. The ratio is the product of an enemy that could not reposition fast enough to fight efficiently. Second, the testimony. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations for OKW, stated in his post-war interrogation at Nuremberg that Patton represented the most dangerous commander the Americans put in the field. Jodl was not speaking about Patton's tactical brilliance in isolation. He was speaking about the specific problem that Patton posed to a command structure designed for deliberate, methodical war. "He did not give us time to think," Jodl said, "and thinking was what we required." Third, the counterfactual. The one instance where Wehrmacht commanders managed to disrupt Patton's tempo, briefly and at enormous cost, was during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, when Patton was ordered to stop his drive into the Saar, reverse his army 90 degrees and relieve Bastogne. The disruption was imposed by Allied High Command, not by German action. Even then, Patton moved the Third Army 100 miles in 48 hours and broke the encirclement of Bastogne on December 26, 1944, a feat that German planners had calculated would require a minimum of 7 days. Bayerlein spent 3 years as an American prisoner of war. He was released in 1947 and spent much of the following decade working with the U.S. Army Historical Division, documenting German operational decisions for the official record. He wrote at length about what he called the velocity problem, the fundamental incompatibility between a hierarchical command culture and an enemy who had been empowered to move without waiting for permission. In one assessment written in 1952, Bayerlein made a point that has outlasted the war itself. He wrote that the Wehrmacht's defeat in the West was not primarily a defeat of men or machines. It was a defeat of a philosophy. Germany had built an army optimized for a certain kind of war, methodical, calculated, controlled from the center. That army was superb at what it was designed to do. But the war it faced in 1944 and 1945 was not that war. And no amount of Tiger tanks could fix a broken decision loop. Patton never changed his tactics to match the Germans. He never fought their war. He fought a different war in the same theater, against the same enemy, and the enemy could not adapt fast enough to survive it. The lesson is not a military lesson. It never was. The institution that cannot change its decision speed will be defeated by the opponent who can, regardless of which side has the superior equipment, the longer tradition, or the deeper expertise. Bayerlein understood this from a farmhouse in Kaiserslautern, staring at a map that had already been made obsolete. The war was over in every way that mattered before the last shot was fired. Speed does not merely win battles. Speed makes the other side's strengths irrelevant. That was the Patton lesson. That was what Bayerlein finally understood, and he had understood it 12 hours too late.